Good evening. Welcome. We're delighted to welcome Professor Francis Fukuyama back to our platform for one of our first programs of the fall 2018. This is a special occasion for the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Earlier today, the Council announced that we received a $4 million gift for its Second Century campaign from the Robert R. McCormick Foundation. These funds from the Robert R. McCormick Foundation will support the Council's mission to promote public engagement in global affairs and an active U.S. role in the world, and specifically to advance understanding of the increasing importance of global cities in influencing political, social, and economic policies around the world. We're deeply grateful to the Foundation for this grant and for the Foundation's long history in supporting the Council's work. It's an honor for us to mark this significant contribution by naming this main room here the Robert R. McCormick Foundation Hall, as you can see on the screens and on the wall. We're thrilled that Professor Fukuyama is the inaugural speaker in our newly named hall. He has spoken at the Council many times over the years, and it's always a highlight of our programming calendar. The last time that Frank Fukuyama addressed our audience, we beamed him in from his office at Stanford University during a symposium on the future of democracy. That was in April 2017, in the wake of the Brexit vote and President Trump's election victory. Tonight, he will examine one of the drivers of those watershed events and the growing divisions we have witnessed across the West, the politics of identity. We welcome you to join this conversation on social media and to ask Professor Fukuyama a question at chi.cnf.io, our online question platform. And while you're reaching for your cell phones to put that URL into your browser, please also take a moment to silence your phones. Finally, note that the views expressed by speakers on the Council's platform are, of course, their own, and they do not represent the institutional positions or opinions of the Council. And with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker. Francis Fukuyama is the Olivier Nomalini Senior Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. He's the chair of the editorial board of the American Interest, which he helped found in 2005. A senior fellow at Johns Hopkins SAIS Foreign Policy Institute, and he's a non-resident fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's the author of many books, including The End of History and The Last Man, Political Order and Political Decay, and his latest book, Identity, The Demand for Dignity and Politics of Resentment, which is available for sale and signing after this evening's program. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Francis Fukuyama back to the Council.
So thanks very much. It's really a pleasure. Wonderful introduction. I'm really glad to be here in Chicago. Some of you may know I was actually born in this city, so I have some rather long-standing ties here. And this has always been a terrific audience. I congratulate you on your new space. It's really a wonderful place to hold these events. So let me begin. Where I'm going to begin is where I left off the last time we were talking about global populism, because that's been my major preoccupation ever since the elections of 2016 that brought Donald Trump to office in the United States and Britain out of the European Union. Since then, we've had a whole series of other populist uprisings. The most recent one happened yesterday with the vote in Sweden, where the Sweden Democrats got 17% of the vote, so they're the third largest party now in the Swedish parliament. This is another anti-immigrant, identity-based party. And my general argument to you tonight is going to be that we are seeing a broad transformation of global politics. In the 20th century, it was largely organized around economic issues between a left and a right that wanted to argue on more equality versus more individual freedom. That's what the left and the right arrayed themselves across that kind of a spectrum. And I think that in the present moment, we are seeing our politics organized along an identity axis in which people's fixed identities determine their politics. And I think that for democracies, this is particularly problematic, and we need to somehow walk our way back from that. So let me go through this argument. Now, I have a very specific use of the term identity. I mean, your identity is on your driver's license, but the sense in which I'm using it is quite specific. Identity really it begins with a psychological phenomenon that Plato in the Republic calls thumos. It is the desire to be recognized, to have one's inner dignity recognized by other people. It's a universal characteristic, and it's very much connected to politics because people are constantly feeling slighted, ignored, invisible to other people. And when they feel that way, they feel very angry, and it drives people into politics because they want the political system to recognize them. It's connected with this feeling that has grown up in modern times that I have an identity deeply buried inside me that other people do not respect, and therefore my struggle is to gain that respect. That inner dignity has to be recognized. Now, this is actually, I think, a master concept that links a lot of different phenomenon in global politics, beginning with democracy, because in a certain basic sense, democratic revolutions, the kinds of color revolutions we've seen around the world, are based on this demand for dignity. If you look back in 2011 at the Arab Spring, it was sparked by a Tunisian vegetable seller, Mohamed Bouazizi, who had his vegetable cart stolen or confiscated by a policewoman. She spat at him, took his livelihood. He went to the governor's office, asked for it back. They wouldn't talk to him, and as a result, he set himself on fire. And that act is what triggered the Arab Spring, because it set off this recognition that in dictatorships like that of Ben Ali, you are not treated as you're not treated as a human being, as a person that is deserving of a minimal amount of respect, someone that should even get an answer from a government agent. You're simply kind of trash that the government can discard when it finds it necessary. If you look at Ukraine in 2013-14, they had what they called the revolution of dignity against Viktor Yanukovych's regime. He was a very corrupt, pro-Kremlin basically very close to a number of Ukrainian oligarchs. And I think the issue, again, for the young Ukrainians that were rebelling against this was to claim a kind of agency away from the kleptocrats that had defined Ukraine's semi-authoritarian politics up to this point. And that's the struggle that they have been playing out ever since then. And so dignity is related to democracy. A liberal democracy recognizes us on a universal basis. It recognizes us by giving us rights to speech, to association, to freedom of belief, and ultimately to political participation through the franchise. That's the sense in which we are all equal adults. The problem, and by the way, I actually said this way back in my 1992 book, The End of History and the Last Man. It's just that a lot of people never got to the last few chapters of that book, so they didn't read this part of it. But what I actually said back then is that the problem with this desire for recognition, for the recognition of dignity, is that a lot of people aren't satisfied by the universal recognition that it is accorded to them in a liberal democracy. they take it for granted. When they're living in a dictatorship, they hate that, and they want that kind of sense of respect. But once it comes, it's just becomes part of normal life. And they want other things. They want to be recognized in very specific ways as members of particular groups, or even as individuals that are different from other people, that are better than other people. And so you have other phenomena that arise out of this same demand for dignity. One of them is nationalism. In the 19th century, European politics, really beginning with the French Revolution, was about this demand that cultural nations that were buried in large empires be recognized as nations. This was very much a part of the two world wars, the demand that the Germans all live in a single, within a single polity, that the Serbs have their own country, so on and so forth. I believe it actually explains some of the psychology of modern Islamism, where many of the young fighters that grow up in Europe are very confused as to whether they are European or whether they're really basically Middle Eastern still. And what the Islamic State does is gives them a strong sense of identity. You are part of this global ummah that has been despised. Muslims have been killed and persecuted around the world, and now you have agency where you can do something about it. And so the desire for dignity does not only take this universal form that we celebrate in a liberal democracy, it takes a much more specific form, especially among groups that have been marginalized and dispossessed in other respects. And it's the anger at that marginalization and the sense of justice that one needs to be properly recognized that I think lies behind the identity politics. Now, this brings us to what is going on in developed democracies like the United States, because we have identity politics. I mean, this term started to be used in the 1960s and 70s already. It was really associated in the first instance with the politics of the left, because beginning in the 1960s, you had a number of major, very important social movements, the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the LGBT movement for gay marriage, the disabled, Native Americans. All of these groups were undervalued. All of them had been invisible to mainstream white male American society prior to that point, and they wanted recognition justly. And that continues in the Me Too movement and Black Lives Matter, in many of the other social currents happening today. But there was a transformation, I think, in the broad agenda of the left, both in the United States and in Europe, away from the traditional class-based broad coalitions that characterized politics through much of the 20th century to identity-based politics that was based on the specific grievances of specific groups that increasingly took hold as the 20th century drew to a close and the 21st century began. And in the process, the overall nature of both American and European politics changed, because the old working class, the old white working class that had been the basis of support of the Democratic Party in the United States, part of the New Deal coalition of Franklin Roosevelt, and the working class in Europe, people that had voted for the French Communist Party, the German Social Democrats, or the German left, began over the years to defect and to start to vote for these new identitarian parties. Now, the problem, I think, with identity politics as it has evolved is the following. And so let me begin by saying, I mean, in one sense, there's no problem at all, right? Identity politics tries to rectify the specific wrongs that are done to specific groups. And in that respect, it is absolutely just and absolutely important. There's lots of police violence, a lot of sexual aggression, and those are real things that need to be taken care of. The problem, if it comes to characterize the politics of a democratic society in general is severalfold. First is when it begins to erode a kind of sense of common citizenship, because the emphasis is really on what makes people different and differently victimized, rather than things that they potentially hold in common with other citizens. It makes governance very difficult because it requires then this effort to bridge and to find common ground with people that you've identified as being quite different from yourself. We see this in universities. There's actually a new book by Greg Lukianov and John Haidt on the rise of a certain kind of intolerance in university campuses that's very much driven by this sense of identity that divides people into people that are with us and people that are against us, and that has consequences for the way that citizens can discuss events. And finally, I think that the identity politics on the left, in a way, the worst outcome of this is that it has given rise to an identity politics on the right. If you want to understand why people have been voting for Donald Trump, there is obviously an economic grounding to this. So I think we're all familiar with this kind of analysis that says that this is born in the old working class, deindustrialization, the unequal effects of globalization, job loss among manufacturing workers and so forth. And all of that is true. But there's a lot of other people, both in this country and in Europe, that vote for these right-wing, anti-immigrant, identitarian parties for other reasons, for cultural reasons, essentially, because they feel that there has been a kind of conspiracy on the part of existing elites, to open up the economy, to open up the society to very large numbers of foreigners, and they blame those foreigners and the globalization and the outsourcing and the foreign competition for their loss of status. These are groups that used to define the national identity of their respective societies, and all of a sudden they're in a very different, much more low-status position. Arlie Hochschild, a sociologist at Berkeley, had this she did a study of Tea Party voters in rural Louisiana that was published 2 or 3 years ago, where she had this central metaphor. When she talked to these respondents, they imagined a line. They were all standing in a line. There's a little house at the end of the line that was marked the American Dream, and people were going through this one by one, and they were sitting there waiting patiently their turn. They're raising families, working at jobs. And then all of a sudden, these other people were cutting in line ahead of them. African Americans, women, Syrian refugees, a lot of people that somehow didn't seem to be, playing by fair rules. Now, I'm not saying this is a correct perception, but I think if you want to understand this populist Trump phenomenon, you have to understand this identitarian perspective, this feeling that your national identity is somehow being taken from you. And the fact of the matter is, if you look at the figures for the movement of people within the European Union, not in in the old part of the European Union, not so much in the newer Eastern European member states, but Germany, France, Britain, the Netherlands, and so on. If you look at the Commonwealth countries, Australia, Canada, and you look at the United States, the number of foreign-born is really quite extraordinary. In this country, it's about 15% of the total population. In most other Western European countries, it's gotten up to that level over the last 10 years. And so there is, in fact, a great deal of very rapid social change going on. The problem with all of this, I think, is very clear, and we can see it unfolding in our country. This kind of content, driven both by economics but also very heavily by the sense of lost identity, is a threat to liberal democracy. You have populist politicians like our president who use the legitimacy of being elected to office to basically claim a charismatic mantle of legitimacy, that he is going to fix these problems, as he said at the Republican convention when he accepted the nomination. I alone understand your problems, and I alone can fix them. So taking that mantle of legitimacy, he then becomes an institution destroyer, because in a liberal democracy, we don't just have elections to legitimate leaders, we also have checks and balances that prevent executives from doing whatever they want. But as very typical with most of these new populist leaders, they basically feel that they've got this direct, charismatic mandate, and institutions are simply standing in the way of doing what they want to do, or in Trump's case, threatening, him and his family personally. And they don't care very much about the institutional framework that will survive them, once they leave power. This is a situation that I think a lot of democracies are in right now, and why we are, really at a very delicate point in terms of the development of, established democracies, because the one thing you could take for granted was what political scientists called a consolidated democracy. That is to say, once you reached, a period where you'd had several successful changes of party between elections, that you would never slide backwards. And I think now you're seeing very clear signs that this is, in fact, all too powerful in existing democracies, including in our democracy. So I have a number of suggestions for what you do about this. Some actual policy suggestions about how you can walk back from this kind of identity politics. I just spent a week in Iraq teaching a course there, and in a certain sense, if you want to see identity politics run wild, that's Iraq or Syria or any number of Middle Eastern countries where the identity you're born with basically determines the political affiliations you follow for the rest of your lives. We Americans, I think, tried to convert Iraq into a little model of the United States, and I'm afraid that we're getting kind of converted into a little model of Iraq as time goes on. I hope this doesn't continue, but we'll have to see. Thank you.
Frank, thanks very much. That was an excellent sort of exposition. And before I get to the issue of how do we get out of this, which of course all of us are very interested to hear about, I want to press you a little further on the question of the inevitability. Is this, the way you explained it, it sort of seemed to me that this is just the next stage of human development. In terms of democracies who become consolidated, identities first become more important, the dignity is recognized, but then it's less important because democracy doesn't make it that. And sort of, is it inevitable? And it is the most developed democracies where you're seeing this phenomenon. How'd you look at this?
No, it's absolutely not inevitable, and this is really one of the areas where leadership actually makes a big difference. So the thing about identity is it's a very plastic concept. It's socially created by people that talk about certain kinds of identities. And, we happen to have a very good demagogue of a president who is feeding a lot of racial, and ethnic, resentments that are out there in the society. But, the same kind of president could play the opposite role where, he or she tries to smooth that over. And in fact, this does get into what I think is the solution, which is that we have to actually return to leaders that emphasize national identity. A national identity that is liberal, meaning open to everybody. It is suitable to the kind of de facto multicultural society that we live in, where everybody has a chance of participating. But it also has to be substantive, and so it has to be based on things like constitutionalism, the rule of law, principle of equality, and the Declaration of Independence, substantive political principles. There has to be some common glue that Americans see and a common narrative about their society that they can use to explain why they are Americans as opposed to some other people. And that's all something that can be done, I think, through leadership, and I think that's really what's necessary at this point.
So let me push that a little further, because I can see how a more national leadership, as you describe it, might be a effective counterpart to a more demagogic kind of leadership we have today. But if we achieve that national leadership, what is going to be the essence of political difference? If we're all going to be, what is the new way in which
What
we're going
I
to
would love to see is for us to actually return to a serious discussion of social class rather than these particular fixed identity groups. Because, so for example, if you read Bob Putnam's book, Our Kids, it's actually, he looks at the same data that Charles Murray did in his book about the white working class. Both of these books are amazing because what they show is that the single biggest dividing line between Americans who are doing well and Americans that are doing poorly is class defined by education. If you've had a university education or higher over the last 20 years, you've done great. Your family, lower divorce rates, fewer single-parent families, higher incomes, better education, more opportunities for kids. You have less than a high school education, you've just fallen through the cracks. And that is true across all of the existing ethnic and gender groups. So it's true for Hispanics, it's true for African Americans. I mean, every single one of these groups has seen this divergence between people doing well and people doing poorly, defined by class and not so much by things like gender, ethnicity, race, and sexual orientation and so forth. And so what I think we need is actually to think seriously. I mean, that's the other thing that annoys me a little bit about campus identity politics because, it's so easy. You have a student protest and then the dean says, okay, we're going to have a new ethnic studies department of such and such, instead of trying to actually figure out what kind of concrete social policies will provide health care for this particular group, and how are you going to pay for it? And how are you going to persuade people that they should vote their tax money in order? I mean, that's the kind of conversation that I think a politician in this country really ought to be having because the inequality problem here is very, very bad. And it has been getting worse steadily over the last 30 years. And so therefore, I just think that actually going backwards into the 20th century, it would be fine with me, if we could actually think about social policy seriously again.
So if it's not inevitable that you move from a class-based political competition to an identity-based competition, and that a class-based one is, and I would agree with that, I think that's right, where does the responsibility lie that we still haven't fixed that class-based responsibility? Isn't part of the reason we have identity politics is because we haven't fixed some of the really big social and economic problems?
Absolutely. So, I mean, I also think that the United States has really not thought seriously about social policy in a really long time, and that we could do a lot better if we put a little bit more energy and resources behind this. To me, central example of this is the Affordable Care Act, right? The Affordable Care Act is my idea of really good social policy. It was realistic. It took account of the constraints that we operate in as a two-party democracy, but it was trying to deliver health care to people, Americans that didn't have it. And I think that, actually the previous administration could have done a better job selling it, in the first place. And certainly people could have focused much more on actually making the thing work than they have, rather than letting it be, characterized by people that were very hostile to it, right from the get-go. And by the way, that still may work in the November election because I think people actually still care about their health care.
Well, we're having an interesting referendum in Utah, in Tennessee, and Iowa whether to expand Medicaid. And some of the polls indicate that in those three states they're going to vote in order to do that. An article in the New York Times the other day about Joe Manchin doing really well in West Virginia because of health care being a key issue there. We have now, if I can characterize it, a Democratic Party that is defined by identity politics, and a Republican Party that is defined by a different kind of oppositional identity politics. How do you break through? that
So-
reality that seems to be happening?
So that is so essentially, what's been going on over the last couple of decades, but accelerated under Trump, is that the Republican Party is becoming the party of white people. And the Democratic Party is becoming the party of minorities plus a few white professionals thrown in. And that's not a healthy situation, right? And so how do you fix that? Well, I mean, I can't give advice to the Republicans other than pick a different leader. But the Democrats, I think, have a really, really big choice ahead of them, which is really critical. So they can either double down on the existing identity focus that they've had in the last few elections. And that's very good for winning elections because all of your activists live inside these identity groups, right? And so you can get African Americans and women, suburban women and LGBT community. I mean, all these groups, you can get them out on election day to try to win an election. Or you can make an effort to try to get back some of that white working class that has been defecting steadily ever since Reagan in the 1980s, that used to be part of your New Deal coalition. I mean, this is a thing that people forget, but in the 1930s, like 80% of rural whites in the South voted Democratic, because Democrats were the party of redistribution. They were poor and, they were going to benefit from this stuff. Of course, it was based on a pretty bad racial policy at that time. But, the fact of the matter is that Trump won the election. He lost the popular vote. He won the election because enough of these white voters switched from Democratic to Republican in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, all right? And I think that it's important to get them back. I think it's important to not have the parties simply become kind of racial parties, even if unofficially. I think it's important to have these broad coalitions because, among other things, even if you can win an election by mobilizing the identity groups, it's going to be hard to govern under those circumstances unless, you can show that your policies actually appeal to, a wide swath of Americans.
So, final question before I open up to the audience is the institutional capacity that exists within our system that can countervene the pressures that are both on the left and the right on identity politics. Are they strong enough? Can democracy survive? Not only here, but frankly, because it's a phenomenon that you rightly point out is happening in Europe too. We are seeing the retreat of democracy in a lot of places, not the collapse, but the retreat. How strong are the institutional levers that exist, the checks and the balances, the rule of law, the free press, the fact that we do still have elections? How confident should we be that we will find?
Well, I think what we found is that in Eastern Europe, they actually were a lot weaker than they thought they had become in the period after 1989. So Hungary and Poland essentially have dismantled their independent judiciaries over the last, couple of years, which is a very bad outcome. And I'm really worried about what's going to happen to them in the future. Western Europe is a different story. I think that, those institutions, continue to be pretty strong. And you do have some fairly inspirational leaders, like Macron on the other side. In this country, I would say the following. The institutional checks and balances have generally proven to be pretty strong, but in a democracy, the single most important check is an electoral check. And that means that the election that is going to happen in November is going to be, in my opinion, one of the most important in American history. And I say that not because I'm a partisan Democrat. I say that because I just observing political systems and how they work. You're not going to have a strong check unless the voters, resoundingly say, yeah, we don't like this kind of divisive policy. And so I think a lot of what happens in this country will depend on what happens in November. So go vote.
Always a good idea. Let me open up to the audience for your questions and put up your arm and I will recognize it. And if you can wait for the microphone, that will help everyone who's listening online to be there. So let's start over in the back the gentleman with the pink shirt.
Thank you for your comments, Dr. Fukuyama. I just wanted to say that one of the most important events this fall, in my opinion, globally, is an election in Brazil. And I just wondered if you had any comment about the one or more populist candidates in Brazil, or I know you're not a forecaster, but maybe what to look for in that election.
Well, the single thing to look for is whether Jair Bolsonaro gets elected. I mean, he's been compared to Donald Trump, but he's much, much worse. I mean, he's an open fascist, who's advocated military takeover of his country. When he voted to impeach Dilma Rousseff, he said that, it's too bad she wasn't still in jail. He's a really bad character. And unfortunately, with Lula out of the running, he's the most popular candidate. That's not to say he's absolutely popular, but he's the most popular of the existing candidates. And so it's going to be very dicey whether the non-Bolsonaro candidates can actually narrow the field to one person that can actually hold the line against him. It's a tragedy what's happened in that country because, the whole thing started out, I think, as a fairly nonpartisan civic movement against corruption, which is pervasive. But because of the way the judicial system handled it and because of the way it played into the party politics there, it's become a very partisan issue, and it's a super polarized country. I commented in an interview in a Brazilian newspaper, and I was told to go back to Havana, where I belonged, where communists like me belonged. It gives you an idea of what the tone of discourse there is.
Let me ask you a question that came in online, which is the demand for recognition rooted in any dissatisfaction with the liberal world order? To what extent is that order part and parcel of the problem?
So again, this is an issue I talked about at fair length in The End of History and the Last Man, because I said, what does the liberal order at its best produce? It produces peace and prosperity. And is that enough for people? Do people simply want, security and a regular paycheck? And I think the answer to that is they sure like that rather than recession, unemployment, a lot of other bad things. But no, it's not enough. And in particular, for certain individuals, it's not enough because we human beings want to have aspirations, we want justice, we want, great objectives. We have ambitions, some of which are good. You have the Churchills and the Abraham Lincolns, but then some of them are also bad. So you have the Maos and the Stalins and so forth. And so I think that in a democratic political system, part of the trick is to contain the really negative ambitions that are really going to harm the society. That's why we've got checks and balances. So I actually mentioned Donald Trump in that original 1992 book because I said that one of the things that a market economy does is it serves as a sink for the energies of fantastically ambitious individuals that would otherwise become a Caesar. And I said Trump is an example of this, and little did I know that, 25 years later, he's still there.
We won't blame you for it, although the temptation exists. The gentleman over here in the front. If you wait for the microphone, because otherwise no one will hear.
My question comes from Ivo's question about the inevitability of this, starting with perhaps Jane Mayer's book on the role of dark money in American politics. One of the things that's come pretty coterminous with the Citizens United case has been the explosion of dark money flowing through the system. There were professional organizers thrown behind the Tea Party groups. There were lots of financial and organizational support for them. And since then, really wealthy groups have been putting a lot of money into these kind of things. So the question is this also a deliberate creation of our politics? And are there, we'll call them for want of a better term, dark forces at work here with big money who are also encouraging this kind of identitarian politics precisely because it serves their political interests?
Well, sure. There's plenty of dark money. The Supreme Court, in its wisdom, has said that this is a form of free speech and therefore it's protected by the First Amendment. So it's not subject to the kind of usual legislative, regulatory remedies that it is in other countries, in other democratic countries. And that's a huge problem that I think has done a lot to delegitimate the democratic politics, I mean, it's corrupted our politics and it's delegitimated it in many respects, and we don't seem to have a clear way of getting out of it. I will, however, make one qualification, which is that if you look at the Sanders campaign, at the Trump campaign itself, there's still places where that money does not determine outcomes. I mean, if the Koch brothers got their way, I guess Rubio or somebody would be president now, and they weren't able to, to manipulate that outcome. But yeah, it is definitely a big problem.
I'm going to go in the back, and there's a lady right there.
Hi, I recently spent a lot of time in West Texas, and to synthesize what I talked about to Uber drivers, to grocery checkout people, is that there's an intuitive and feeling that the rule of law, it's a good idea, but it doesn't apply to the 1%. And so there is a chip on people's shoulder that our country's not fair. And you spoke about a class system. Well, I'm not sure how that all fits in, but they're really angry because the rule of law doesn't apply to them. And the Great Recession was 10 years ago. One checker said, well, who was held, essentially said, who was held accountable to that? Did anyone go to jail? If you're a 1%er, you're not going to be held accountable in our country. So I think that is part of the impetus, at least in West Texas, where it's real Trump land, that at least he's saying something about it.
Yeah, well, I wish he had acted on some of the things he'd said, when he was complaining about Wall Street and the little guy and money in politics, but almost everything he's done since he's been president has actually made that problem worse. So I don't think he's actually, and that's the problem with that kind of populist demagogy, is that you use it to get elected, but you're actually not serious about the issue, and therefore, you don't actually do anything to remedy the underlying situation. But yeah, you're absolutely right that we've got a big problem of concentrated wealth in this country. I live in Silicon Valley, and I'll tell you that the problem is not just limited to Wall Street fat cats. There's a huge amount of concentrated power in the platforms that dominate the internet and social media and everything else. And I think unless we figure out how to get these sources of power under better democratic control, we're not going to have a good democracy.
So let me push you on that a little bit, because you rightly, and I think I would certainly agree, and the question implies agreement, said we need to go back to a class-based politics, which in part is a politics that says we need to take care of those who are not gaining from the system in the same way that others, not necessarily without undermining the system, but by redistributing in some different ways. How do we do that in today's world when the inequality probably today is as bad as it was 120 years ago in this country, when the new monopoly power, as we were talking earlier, of the internet and of some of those big companies is comparable to the railroad and the Standard Oil power of the turn of the last century? How do we form a politics or a set of social policy and economic policies that starts getting at this issue in a real way rather than in a demagogic way, which is relatively easy to do?
Well, so I think actually democratic politics is perfectly adequate to do this. It's basically a matter of power. So you have to get power. How do you get power in a democracy? Well, several things. You need grassroots mobilization. That's already happening in the United States, but there needs to be a lot more of it. People ought to get off, they need to get off their behinds and, start being activists and that sort of thing. It needs leadership. I think this was the big problem with the Occupy movement, is that they didn't have clear policy objectives, and they didn't have a clear objective of getting their people into Congress. I think that's now been fixed, because there's a lot more people that are now running for office than previously. And it needs, the right kind of top-down leadership. coupled with, I think, external triggers that allow people to suddenly see what the problem is. So I wrote about this in my last book, in Political Order and Political Decay, about the progressive movement. In a way, the movement against corruption in government really only got its start after the assassination of James Garfield in 1873, because he had just been elected and he was assassinated by an office seeker, and that shamed Congress into actually passing the Pendleton Act and trying to clean up the patronage system in Congress. So sometimes it takes an external war, financial crisis, catastrophe of some sort to convince people that they really, need a different form of politics. But the other elements have to be there: the grassroots mobilization and the leadership and the ideas.
Go here, right up front. Right up front here. Yeah, if you wait, microphone's coming. Thanks.
The situation that you describe, has it not been built structurally into the way our political system has evolved, such as with gerrymandering, such as closed primaries, such as Citizens United, which someone else already mentioned. So we've built this partisanship into and even certain Senate rules. So we've built a degree of this partisanship into the structure, and it's going to be, in my opinion, very difficult to overcome. I'd like to know your thoughts on that.
The partisanship and the polarization has a lot of different roots, some of which are institutional and some of which are just out there in the society. Among the institutional rules, I think the single one that really promotes it the most is the fact that we've got these first-past-the-post single-member district elections, where it just gives a tremendous incentive to elect somebody from one of the two leading parties. My colleague Larry Diamond and I are both big proponents of an Australian-type limited preferential ballot, or what do they call it in San Francisco these days, ranked choice voting, which would make it much, much easier to run a third-party candidate in whatever district you are, and would also promote a lot more cross-party collaboration for the second and third preferences. So keep that in mind. Ranked choice voting, if the issue comes up, you should support it. But I think that a lot of pro-democratic reforms ended up having unanticipated consequences, like open primaries. Part of the reason that the Tea Party got to be so powerful in the Republican Party is because of the post-1970s reforms that took the power to select candidates away from the party hierarchy and gave it to ordinary voters. And it turns out, who votes in a primary? Not ordinary people, but activists, And so you get these results that are determined by 7-8% of the total electorate, where you get an extremist candidate selected. And so that one is a more complicated thing, where it's very hard to imagine walking back popular primaries, but in some sense, I think something like that would be necessary. The gerrymandering, we'll see. I think that's a political struggle that you could imagine. If there's a blue wave, you could have a big reversal in a lot of the states that had been gerrymandered, and then hopefully more neutral rules. Every other serious democracy with single-member districts that has to be redistricted gives it to a nonpartisan, professional commission to do, not to the political parties. We're just about the only democracy that sees fit to do it in that manner. It's stupid, and we could change it.
Well, they have in California with both open primaries
and top two.
And the top two vote, which does change the dynamic. We're going to go to the lady in the middle over here.
We hear a lot about the people left behind, and most of us completely understand that. What we rarely hear is about all of the people, Lakeshore Drive, Streeterville, the suburbs, who voted for Trump. Many are the 1%, and there are a lot of family feuds going on in very affluent circles, but no one hardly talks about that.
Well, that's absolutely true. A whole lot of people voted for Donald Trump that were not, working class, people that had lost their jobs in a manufacturing plant, because of deindustrialization and Chinese competition. That's absolutely the case. There's very complicated motives behind that, which is why I think the identity issue is something that is not appreciated, because I do think that, one of the reasons a lot of people like Donald Trump is that he's not politically correct. And they were really, really irritated by the kind of political correctness that comes out of left-wing identity politics. And that by itself was a sufficient reason that they wanted to vote for somebody that would shake that up. The issue actually that I really meant to talk about and I didn't get around to was immigration, because I think there again, it's actually a very complicated issue. There's a lot of evidence, empirical evidence, that suggests that immigration is the single issue that correlates, or hostility to immigration is the single issue that correlates the most strongly with people voting for populist parties. And this is not simply by poor people who compete directly against immigrants. These are also these people on Lakeshore Drive that worry about the nature of their societies changing. And I think that this is an issue that in many respects our political system has failed to deal with in a serious way. I actually think that this is also a big vulnerability in the Democratic Party, because I actually don't think that they've got the right position. They have not found the right position on immigration in many respects. But it's something that if we solved through comprehensive immigration reform, I think would actually take the wind out of the sails of a lot of populist voters. And I think in Europe, you'd have the same result. If Europe could figure out a way to actually secure its outer borders, then I think a lot of the populism that's producing these new populist coalitions in Italy, a lot of that animus would also be taken away.
So what is the right immigration policy that would push this?
It's been on the table for the last 20 years. Comprehensive immigration reform has got to be a trade between, on the one hand, a really credible promise of future enforcement of existing immigration law, whatever the level of legal immigration you set, but you're going to seriously try to enforce the law, coupled with a path to citizenship for the 11, 12 million that are in the country already, right? That's what they tried under previous administrations. That was in IRCA in 1986. That's what they tried in the Bush administration and failed to get, because the opposition on both sides is so dug in, right? In the Republican Party, there's just a faction that absolutely will not consider anything like a path to citizenship. And frankly, on the Democratic side, there are a lot of people that don't think that enforcement is a legitimate function of government, or that it's not something we ought to worry about. And as long as that's the case, we're just going to go on in the current situation where you've got a very large population of undocumented immigrants that do not have legal status, and they're just going to be held in this, never, never land, and people are going to be very unhappy about that situation.
Go back to all the way in the end, talk about immigration.
When you talk about a unifying identity, it's very based on democracy, and you're making some assumptions. And it actually reminds me of a day we had at the last program year where we had Madeleine Albright's book on fascism, and Ed Luce's The Retreat of Western Liberalism. Isn't that unifying identity based on us assuming that our devotion to democracy continues? And how do you react when you hear that maybe only 3 of 10 millennials care about whether they live in a democracy?
Yeah, well, it's very bad. I mean, so these national identities don't just fall from the sky like magic, they're created. How are they created? They're created in your educational system, right? How many public schools continue to teach civics, to students about the Constitution, how constitutional government works, what the rule of law means? How many universities, for that matter, continue to teach that kind of material, to try to prepare American elites to run their own country? Fewer and fewer of them. And so therefore, unless you invest in that kind of consciousness about, what it means to be an American and what the Constitution means and what, the rule of law means, you're not going to get citizens, or you're going to get the kind of citizens that you referred to.
Question that we got online that is interesting, given that there's an increased impact on non-state factors, whether it's terrorism or cyber or cryptocurrencies, how does democracy adapt to this transnational, non-state phenomenon that is increasingly happening?
Well, unfortunately, I think that states have, I still think that states are the basic building block of the international order. You can have all sorts of international organizations that perform all sorts of very specific, very important functions, food labeling or international air traffic control rules, international intellectual property. All this stuff is very important, but the thing that is still unique about nation states is the fact that they are the only ones that can legitimately use force to enforce rules. International organizations cannot do that, and subnational groups, if they try to do that, like the mafia, are in the wrong business, And so states play this role of legitimately using force or the threat of force to actually enforce order, rules, law, and the like. And as long as that's the case, it seems to me that any kind of international cooperation ultimately has to be built on the basis of cooperation between states. In Europe, they've delegated, a lot of powers now to Brussels that are no longer within the sovereign control of the member states, and that's creating a lot of problems because the European Union does not have a way of democratically controlling those powers, and so it's off in the hands of these bureaucrats that really are only very indirectly connected to the citizens that they purportedly serve. So.
Time for one more question. The gentleman over in the middle.
So to what degree do you think that some of the phenomena that you've been describing, the turn towards identity politics and the resentment, is affected by the end of the Cold War? And just let me elaborate a little bit. We had a 1% during the Cold War, and they were willing to bear a lot more financially towards redistributive policies, and some of those policies were failures, but there was that willingness. Now there's no alternative, and not as much maybe even as the desire to win the hearts and minds of the general populace, because again, there's no real alternative in their minds. And I'm wondering if that has a tie-in with what we're facing today.
That's very possible. I think that when you feel you're in an existential, prolonged struggle with another great power, it concentrates your mind to do all sorts of things. So I don't doubt that many, for example, in the Cold War, a lot of capitalists said, yeah, we need a welfare state. We're competing with the Soviet Union, which takes care of everybody, and if we don't do something along those lines, we're not going to be competitive with them. And so I think that justified a lot of Republicans, accepting the New Deal and, the welfare state provisions that it entailed. There's another really sinister thing about the end of the Cold War, however, that's played into our current politics, which is that the moment that Russia stopped saying it was communist and started pretending that it was a Christian power, I think that it legitimated a switch on the part of many people on the right, both in the United States and in Europe, to say, okay, they're okay. And in fact, and you hear this on a lot of voices on the far right in the United States, that I prefer Vladimir Putin to Hillary Clinton, because at least he believes in God, he's anti-gay marriage, he believes in traditional values, all of which my liberal Americans don't believe in anymore. And that's another respect in which I think there's been this rather unfortunate ideological shift, that was really brought about by the end of the Cold War.
We had some optimistic notes. So let's concentrate on those. Frank, thanks very much for helping us to understand our predicament. If you want to know more about it, his book is for sale. You will be signing it. Thank you all for coming. Very much appreciate it.
Thank you.
Come back
Thanks
soon.
to you both.
Thanks.